We do want to introduce Lindy Johnson, who's the Director of External Affairs for the Contra Costa Transportation Authority. So come on up, Lindy.
I'm going to move around a little bit. Good morning. I had the pleasure of being here last year to talk a little bit about CCTA, Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and Gomentum Station, which is our autonomous vehicle testing facility out in Concord, actually at the Concord Naval Weapons Station. And we talked a little bit about what Gomentum is, how it operates, and sort of our vision for Gomentum in the future and why we think that it could be an economic development driver in Contra Costa County and sort of what we think that could mean. And we're actually really excited in the next few weeks. I think there'll be some announcements and some information about some of our testing partners and how they're actually deploying outside of Gomentum, which is pretty cool. But I'm not going to talk about Gomentum today. So if anyone is excited or interested in chatting about Gomentum and Gomentum 2.0 and where that vision is, please come chat with me. Me or Mike would be happy to chat with you. But today, I'm actually here to talk just about CCTA because I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of information about where we're at as an agency, what we're thinking about, and where we are as it relates to Measure Day, the sales tax that was passed that funds CCTA. So CCTA is funded by a half-cent sales tax. It's collected by CCTA as a special district and distributed by CCTA. And it's distributed mainly in two pots. We have a capital program and a programs program, which does not have the best sound to it, programs program. Most of our capital dollars have been expended on major projects in many of your jurisdictions, including BART to Antioch, or the Caldecott Tunnel, or overcrossing bike and pedestrian projects, right? Most of those capital dollars were bonded against, and we have spent about 93% of them. The programs continue to be expended every year, and we fund things like transit and ferry service, bike and pedestrian projects, safe route to school, programs that get people ideally out of their car and onto things like buses, or trying things like shared bike. All of these are programs and dollars that go out into the community to hopefully help improve folks' quality of life and to make transportation easier in Contra Costa County, right? At the end of the day, that's our mission and really a lot of the values that are held by the agency. We're also a congestion management agency, which means that we are required to think about how to manage congestion. And I'm emphasizing the word manage there because there's a big difference between reducing and managing. And in Contra Costa, we're really looking at how to manage the congestion. So really quick, I want to get a little interactive. How many of you are familiar with the term GHG? Right, okay, pretty familiar, right? How many of you were familiar with Mark is really excited. How many of you were familiar with it about 10 years ago? Okay, so probably about half of those that raised their hands. How many of you are familiar with the term VMT? Okay, so about the same amount that I would say are familiar with GHG about 10 years ago, right? So VMT stands for vehicle miles traveled, and it's going to be more important every day for those of us in the transportation world and field. And many of you who are in planning or work in planning will certainly be impacted by it as well, right? Our challenge and communications team is to also get VMT out in the public sphere in the same way GHG is, right? Where folks understand it, they talk about it, and they're able to communicate with others about why it matters. And why it matters has a lot to do with what we can and cannot do in transportation. So, for example, a lot of folks, when we go out into the community in places like Oakley, will often talk to us about building a freeway that would connect that part of East County to Livermore. Right? There's some questions that folks will say about, like, why can't we do that? That makes so much sense. It would be so great if we could just drive that way instead of having to go all the way around. So the question often comes back to a conversation around VMT, right? What that would do is put more vehicle miles traveled on the road, and we no longer can do that. So if we wanted to build something like that, we'd have to find a way to mitigate for those extra vehicle miles traveled that would be happening through that freeway. Now, perhaps that would be possible, right? Perhaps you would put an express bus or a rail line or something that would give folks an alternative to the car to provide that same connection, and in that also reduce VMT, right? I'm not going to get too much more technical than that, but the reason I wanted to share VMT with you is because I think it's really important as we start to talk about our countywide transportation plan. So we're going to hear a little bit about Envision 2040, a large planning effort, 45, excuse me. 2045. See, I was not a communications director for that project. And similarly, we are embarking on a large planning project called the Countywide Transportation Plan. You've probably heard this happen before, right? It's not a brand new term, but the effort is going to be underway in a somewhat new way, because we have to consider projects that are not these large-scale, huge capital projects that we would have likely considered in previous years that would have increased VMT. And instead, we're having to really think about what might get folks out of their cars, what might stimulate economic development in communities by making sure that transit is really accessible and people can move in and out of downtowns. And we're really talking about what we're calling placemaking and thinking about how to create place, and what transportation's role is in doing so. And what is transportation's role as it relates to planning and density and things like that. So these are important conversations, they're planning conversations, and they're also a question to all of you and the public that you serve about what they'd like to see transportation look like in Contra Costa County. Do they want there to be mobility hubs in their communities where folks can kind of park their cars and easily take bike share and transit and shuttles to get to other places throughout Contra Costa County in modes that are shared, right? Or are they really interested in seeing express bus down 680 and they want to see something that's going to get folks out of their cars on 680 to reduce congestion specifically in that area? These are examples of the kinds of questions that will be asked through the Countywide Transportation Plan. We'll also be asking about things like placemaking, right? Where would you like to see city streets dedicated more to bicyclists and pedestrians? And where would you like to see city streets really concentrated on transit or really concentrated on car traffic? And is it possible that some of your parallel streets might serve different purposes, not all the same purpose? So this is the kind of stuff I get excited about, and I certainly hope that you all will help us to get your communities excited about providing their feedback. This is an effort that'll be underway over the next about year, and so I'll certainly be reaching out to everyone via email, asking for survey responses, helping us spread the word so that we can get feedback to folks, so that we hopefully create a plan that is actually reflective of what people want to see in their communities, but also gets them to dream about a transportation system that looks very different than the transportation system they use now. When we do behavioral research, we see that a lot of people don't want to drive, but they feel like it's the choice that they have. And so the question we're really interested in is, what would it take for you to try something else? And what would you like to try? What feels most accessible to you? And so we're really excited about that. Certainly there's a lot of technology and innovation that you hopefully all know CCTA is really interested in that would be a part of this planning, trying to kind of understand where folks' receptiveness is to that and hearing from you all about what you feel like your businesses and economic communities would be open to. But there's also just an element of really wanting to hear from the public. And so we're very much hoping you will help us to get some responses and get some insight and ask great questions, as I'm sure you all do, about what this could mean for your communities. So that's the Countywide Transportation Plan. It's coming, and we can't wait for you all to be part of it, and very much want to learn from some of the efforts you've undergone in similar ways in the last few years. So if you have some great lessons learned, please send them forward. Will's already going to do that for me. For Envision 2045. So thank you all so much. It's been great to be here.
Are there any questions? If so, we're going to use a microphone to capture the questions.
Hi, Lindy. Question, Allison Greenlee with Contra Costa Department of Conservation Development. What is the next step in terms of the county's transportation plan? So just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So quick timeline. We envision going out, envision is the word of the day, going out in December and January for a preliminary survey that will be more about behavior change. What are folks kind of receptive to? Policies and principles questions, right? Like, how would you like to see safety incorporated into your community? Is that reducing speed limits? Is it speed bumps? Like, what are some things that you feel like could work in your community, but again, that are more on the strategy and policy side? We'll do that in December and January, hopefully being able to provide something in February that's a bit of a summary of that, and that'll be incorporated in kind of the preliminary draft of the CTP. Through those next few months, we'll kind of start to identify projects and really hone in on what a plan or vision would look like. And then we'll go back out to the community in the spring for feedback on some of those ideas and possibly some prioritization, right? If we have 5 ideas in this corridor and you live in that corridor, we want to hear which of them feels right to you. And so we're hoping to also give folks a very visual experience where they're hopefully able to understand, like, when we say an autonomous shuttle, what does that look like or mean? Or when we say a street that is really just for pedestrians or bicycles, does that mean no car can walk on it, or sorry, no car can drive on it? Like, what would that actually look like? And so the hope is that in the spring, we're going out to folks with some really concrete examples and ideas to get feedback through that. And then we do a community event series every year. And so in the early spring and early summer, from early spring through early summer, we'll be incorporating some of that survey opportunity and feedback opportunity into our community event series. So going out into your communities and looking for events. So if you have one that you think it'd be great to have CCTA at, please let me know. And then after that, they'll probably spend a good chunk, probably about 5 to 6 months, kind of incorporating all of that, coming up with a final plan, and then there's actually an EIR process for the CTP that'll take place. The hope is to have it finalized very early 2026.
Oh, one sec.
Thank you. I was going to ask a question about VMT because I think VMT became a driving force behind a lot of decisions a while ago, right, when housing prices were not as high as they are now. So I'm wondering if there's ever been any discussions about maybe moderating how VMT is used, because when you talked about the example of the freeway, what I thought was, well, if there was a freeway to Livermore, that would open up an area and make it more accessible for a lot more new housing development,
yeah.
which would increase housing supply and bring housing prices down. So I'm wondering, because there's a little bit of a conflict there between trying to reduce VMT and trying to increase housing supply by making areas more accessible. So I don't know if that's been talked about.
I would say this is for those of you who love the policy conversation, it's probably the most popular policy conversation in the transportation world. I was just at Focus on the Future, which is a conference of CTAs throughout California, so all of these countywide transportation authorities, and there was a whole, I would say, like 3-hour workshop kind of to answer this question or engage in this, and it was by far the most packed thing at the entire conference. So everyone is asking this question. Last year there was a bill introduced that would have studied whether or not what VMT's relationship really is to GHG reduction. And because there's a question on electric vehicles here too, right? That often gets brought up. And are we competing with ourselves in a sense, right? Are we trying to reduce VMT, but we're also trying to increase electric vehicle adoption, and how do those things complement or contend with each other? So I would say the legislator seems open to having some of these conversations, but at the same time, that bill did not pass. And so I do think there's a lot of conversations behind the scenes about how to address that. We as an agency are also really interested in understanding funding and mitigation, right? A lot of dollars are for capital. And so if we now need to fund a lot of operational mitigation to be able to do a capital project, is there state funding that can help to support operations, which many of you might know is already a large conversation being had, right? Like, how are operations going to be funded in this state as it relates to transit in general? And then how is it going to be funded as it relates to VMT mitigation and operations related to that? So I wish I had a better answer than we're with you and we're very engaged. CCTA in particular has been really a big part of this conversation from the beginning, because we've really looked at VMT banks and done some studies around what could be done, because we had a project on 680 that we were already looking at that we knew would add VMT when this law was passed. So we've been engaged really from the beginning, because we were in one of the first case studies, and we were able to get a VMT mitigation plan passed by Caltrans in the state, which has served as a model. But we also go out and talk about how difficult that was and how complicated it is, and that it really doubles the cost of the project. And what does that mean for the taxpayer? So I'm getting into the weeds and into the details, but if anyone wants to talk about that or is kind of fascinated, I'd love to share. In the meantime, we are tracking every effort to have that conversation, because I wouldn't say this is a finalized thing, and there's a lot of pushback on whether VMT is actually doing what it's intended to do.
Any other questions? Right, with that, let's thank Lindy for her presentation. Thank you.